Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I'm joined by my partner in fear, Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing all right, but I feel a little self-conscious because I just do as I'm told. And so when you said that we were going to review the Tingler, I went out and bought this, this vibrating strap-on attachment, and it's intended for women, so it was really hard to test. I had to approach strangers, it was very awkward, and now I find myself totally unprepared.
I'll tell you what, that's impressive and that thorough. If you went out and actually reviewed that, that's going to be now that you've done that joke though, a review of that device will be on the blog. But yeah, getting back to 1959. You're doing all right. I bought it back to 1959. The second Vincent Price, William Castle collaboration. All about interactive cinema. This is all about. So yeah, it's going to be light on themes, I think. Really, if we dig into this, but there's still things to talk about. But yeah, the Tingler, directed by William Castle, starring Vincent Price, and then a very small cast. I'd forgotten how sort of this is almost like a play in some respects. Yeah. Vincent Price, Judith Evelyn, Daryl Hickman, Patricia Cutts, Pamela Lincoln, and Phil Coolidge. So first question: which version of this did you watch? When it came to the bathtub scene or the bathroom scene, did you have red blood?
Yes.
Ah, good, excellent.
Yeah, the blood is pouring from both the sink and it's filled the tub. Yeah, yes. So I had and apparently they did that in camera just by like painting the background monochrome and doing monochrome makeup on the actress and everything. But it's pretty cool. It's like a little Frank Miller, like black and white and red in the middle of the film.
And yeah, another little William Castle touch of sort of like in a stark black and white film and just throwing in. This red during a fear moment. It's very cool. We'll get into the plot of it, but first I just want to get your first impressions of this film. The last of our sort of 50s films. What are your impressions then of the Tingler?
Well, obviously it's a sort of gimmick, and I love these sort of 50s gimmicks. I love sort of 3D, and in this case sort of they weren't actually electrified seats, but they had like repurposed World War II motors underneath some of the seats. And apparently he also hired actors to be in the audience to sort of scream and faint, and they'd be taken out to a fake ambulance and stuff. And I love this kind of stuff. I love this sort of like theatrical element of cinema. And it reminds me, like, when I was a teenager, I had the idea that I was going to do a play that involved a terrorist plot, and there were going to be, like, actors who take over the theater with machine guns and stuff. And, of course, you couldn't do that in real life, especially today, like, with concealed carry, there'd be, like, a massacre. But, and I do think, like, today there'd be lawsuits over doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, it breaks the fourth wall as well, which I really like. That whole bit at the very end when it's in the cinema and the screen goes black and you have Vincent Price's sort of voice come over and he's saying, "Don't worry, don't be afraid. But if you to help you, just scream, everybody scream." And I can imagine the whole cinema getting involved and really cool. And that's when the buzzers would be going off as well, because that's when the Tingler thing would be in the audience. And so they called it like Sensorama because they'd have things like the other thing is that they'd have air blowers apparently in some of them under the chairs, so it'll blow on the back of your legs, so you think there's something touching you and stuff like it. Yeah, cool. I mean, you get this at theme parks now, but have that in a main cinema. That would be a really cool experience. I'd be quite into that.
Yeah, it's awesome, and it pulls in the theatrical element, but it's also so postmodern. This sort of like incorporating. Yeah, when you get to that moment, and apparently there was another version that was intended for drive-throughs where, they said like, oh, that don't be alarmed, but the Tingler is in this drive-in. Yeah, so I mean, it is. You get to that point in the film, and it's very meta. It seems very, contemporary in a way.
Yeah, and I think William Castle was sort of, I wouldn't say ahead of his time. It was definitely like a pioneer of some of this stuff, and it's fascinating to me to also think though that in the 1950s, only sort of a couple of decades after cinema's really taken off, they were already worrying that cinema wasn't going to survive, and they were looking for ways to bring people back in, to make sure people stayed in the cinema. So that was a part of it. So it's even then, like sort of 70 years ago, they were looking at this.
Well, and the key thing in the 50s was the rise of television, and so like in cinema history, they teach that basically like all of these 3D techniques, all these gimmicks were a way of sort of how do you keep people going to the cinema when they've got one at home, increasingly. And so these were sort of ways to combat television. And that same concern led in the 60s to, the spectacle, to, the opus, the sort of Spartacus, the sort of, and I think that we see a version of that today with a rise of prestige television competing ever more with cinema, that increasingly what fills the cinemas are these $200+ million spectacles, really, that just are on a scale competing in terms of scale and with Revive 3D in a way to try to give the viewer something that you can't quite replicate at home.
No, and I think that's one of the things that's going to be coming. I think is gimmicks are going to sort of creep back in. I mean, you see it in like boutique sort of cinemas now. In America, you got the Alamo Draft House, and they'll do like a themed night. I mean, I saw one where I've seen a couple where they do like they'll play Jaws, and everyone's in a pool, and I'm like, that's really cool. That's everyone's in a swimming pool watching Jaws, and that sort of thing. And I've seen ones at Halloween where you go to a drive-in and it's sort of like playing like Friday the 13th or one of those. And then during it, you'll have someone running up between the cars being chased by someone dressed as Jason or something like that. So
once again, that's where I worry about concealed carry.
yeah. Not so much in this country, and not even because of the weapons, more because of our care of like, ugh, I can't be bothered. Not my problem, But it does creep. And one of the things I saw recently as well, from a technology point of view, we've got IMAX, obviously, at the moment, and you hear about films being filmed to different degrees being IMAX. There's another one that I think Disney is looking to roll out in the next year or so, where you get an extra at the cinema. So it'll be, instead of you get the screen at the front, and then you get an extra 30% either side, and it'll wrap round and stuff. And there'll be scenes that'll sort of like wrap round and all this other stuff. So they are sort of doing it now. Technology, they're using technology to say, well, you can't get this at home, So,
well, and sometimes those things are true. I mean, I remember seeing Avatar in 3D, and when you watch that on TV, it's sort of like, okay, sci-fi, expensive blockbuster. But seeing it in 3D, there are just shots where you're looking down the depth of a spacecraft that just goes on forever, and all of it is, you really perceive in 3 dimensions. And I saw the first Abrams Star Trek in one of those wrap IMAX screens.
Yes.
And that was so much fun. Just like I'm watching space battles, and I can really just kind of I have peripheral vision of like, oh, here come, the another ship from the side.
But to me, that's what cinemas should be. Like, cinema is spectacle. And that's not to say, and this is not to, poo-poo anybody for their opinions and stuff. But like, I don't see the need to go and spend so much money or whatever to go see a small drama about, someone's life on the big screen. Those sort of things I prefer to watch, especially like you see, you know, I'm not big into the cinema, but if there's a really good one, I'll watch it, and I actually prefer to watch those things in the comfort of my own home because that becomes more relatable and that sort of thing. So when people say like, "Oh, you know, auteur cinema is dying," it's like, well, no, it's just moving medium. I think those things will work better on the small screen, especially in streaming services, if we can do that. But to me, if you're looking at a 30-foot screen, like I want to see space battles or dinosaurs or Transformers or aliens or whatever, I want to see something that's a spectacle that blows me away or scares the crap out of me. I want something to jump out at me that's going to, I don't know, that's what cinema is to me, is spectacle rather than, you know, that's what this film provided to some extent, is it provides these little moments of spectacle in 59, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, and I sort of feel the same way about, you know, I rarely, even before COVID, went to the cinema. But I do pine for the days where, you know, you had, especially mid-range films, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that increasingly has shifted to sort of Netflix and streaming services. But, you know, it used to be that you could make you know, an art film for, you know, $1 million or even less, and you'd get it distributed, and you could make, you know, if you were lucky, you could make 100 million. You know, certainly, you know, 25 million was a good haul on a $2 million investment, and now that just, you know, that doesn't even exist anymore. It's very hard to get that distributed.
I'm hoping that sort of cycle will come around again, and that's where streaming will come in, because that's what the 90s were like, you know. Not wanting to sort of, you know, give the Weinsteins any credit, but Miramax really was the sort of the birth of that. You know, there's a number of, like, you know, Quentin Tarantino, Kevin Smith. There's all these sort of filmmakers and these films from the 90s that people love that were very much driven from, you know, we're like, all right, you sound like you've got a good idea. You've got, you know, you've got some indie cred. I'm going to give you a limited budget of, you know, 5 to 10 million. Go make your film, and then, you know, we will distribute it for you. Like there was that ethos of bringing through these small or even foreign sort of filmmakers, and at the moment that doesn't happen unless you're being given a Marvel film.
Yeah, and I think that's increasingly what happens, is that these people bring in a movie or they get some indie cred, and then the next thing is they're jumping to one of these spectacles that they're really ill prepared for. And the other thing is that there are brilliant directors who are sort of being, you know, wasted to one degree or another on these, you know, mindless spectacles. You know, and we're a little off topic, but I mean, none of these spectacles, with rare exceptions, today can compare to like Spartacus, right? I mean, or, you know, I mean, Cleopatra was another example. I mean, back in the days where they thought there's no amount of money you could throw at a movie and it wouldn't make it back if it was one of these big spectacles, and then Cleopatra failed. But I mean, even Cleopatra is, you know, like, that's hugely ambitious. We don't do historical epics anymore. I mean, I guess the last one was like Alexander by Oliver Stone. But we, you know, we don't do that stuff anymore. So yeah,
it's hard when we do, because I think, again, these things come and go. I mean, we are you and I will both watch these spectacle films and approach them and, you know, take different things from them. But like, I honestly think things go in cycles. We have gone through. I think we have gone through the peak of the superhero spectacle film. I think we are going to be on the come down from that. I think, you know, yeah, Disney's probably going to be riding that cash cow for a long time to come, but I do think there'll be something else that comes through that will start to be sort of drive the industry further. These things happen, you know. Yeah, the 70s are a very sort of like grim and gritty era. Like, you know, you've got very much that's a very autistic. And then it gets overtaken by the 80s, which was very spectacle driven. You know, that's the blockbuster era, the first blockbuster era, really, to be taken over by the 90s. And then obviously you come back round and round. So swings and roundabouts. We shall see what happens, I think, in that space. But I agree. I think mid-range films, but I honestly think streaming is going to be that place where if you have a very niche film, then that will be the kind of thing that someone, you know, some of these places will probably link onto, I think.
Well, the one thing that's certain is you couldn't make the Tingler today, right? Because it's clearly done, well, for lots of reasons, but it's clearly done on a low budget.
Yeah.
Most of the budget apparently was spent on those devices in the theater.
Yeah.
Like they spent more money on that than they did on the movie. You know, today that kind of budget and that kind of movie gets either, you know, some sort of like video on demand kind of thing, or it winds up on a streaming service or a cable channel as an original movie. But you're not going to have the opportunity to you know, wire everybody's homes with, you know, electrocution or something.
This is and that's a really good point, actually, because this is a cinema film. Like, it's designed for the cinema. You know, we talk about the sort of the end of the film where it cuts out, and you have the Vincent Price talking, all this other stuff, and the interactive effects that happen. Now, yeah, because, and this is one of the things I like to see spectacle, but you've got to think of the long range. 80%, and probably more than that, 99%, I'd actually say, of a film's lifetime over many decades will be on the small screen. Will be on a home screen, because it only has a limited cinema release. And with this, like, you know, you have to sort of see it. I've got it on Blu-ray, and I do like it. It is a good film, but I've never seen this, and I would love to go to a screening of this, or even the other Castle, any of the William Castle films. So there's like 13 Ghosts or The House on Haunted Hill, those sorts of films, and have like the things going on, like do them in a cinema. I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah, what were the gimmicks there? I think like House of Haunted Hill had like some sort of like ghost on a pulley that went over the audience.
Yeah, it's a skeleton. So
yeah,
there's a skeleton, and there was a skeleton that runs across the top of the audience, and there was some screaming that come out of speakers then as well for part of the film. And I think for 13 Ghosts, it was something similar, that they would have a ghost sort of interaction. Like each of the ghosts had, that was 3D. That was also 3D. As well, so you'd have, like, you know, when the ghosts appeared, things would appear, and that mist would come out, and all sorts of things. So yeah, it was an experience. You know, and I'd love to go and do that. Like, you know, I'd pay a decent cinema ticket price to go do that.
Oh sure, yeah, I would too. And I guess the inheritor of that is really these like amusement park rides. You know, you go to like Disneyland or something, and they're still doing this stuff. And it's pretty cool. I mean, you know, the seats are moving in order to give you like different perspectives on what you're watching.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, this is like those 4D experiences. I mean, the best one I've ever seen of those would be Universal Studios is the Terminator one, which I think's gone now. Yeah. But following Terminator 2, they have like, you go in and again, the thing is, I think this, you say, whoever watched these films took it to the theme parks. And one of the things I always love about American theme parks is that sort of interaction. And Universal Studios did it best, in my opinion. You went on the Back to the Future ride, and you know it's a simulator. You're queuing up to go on a simulator, but as you're queuing up, no, you are queuing up to go in Doc. There's a story. You're going to queue up to go to Doc Brown's lab. You're going to get a video, and it's going to tell you an introduction, and then you're going to see Biff take over the place, and then you're like, now you are the ones that have to save us, or you're lining up to go on a boat ride around Amity Island coast. And then all of a sudden, you're attacked by Jaws, and you've got the person on the boat. It's all acted. It's all interactive. I loved all that stuff. And you know, the Terminator one. Did you ever do any of these?
No.
Have you ever been?
No.
The Terminator one, awesome, because you went in and you were going to Cyberdyne, and you were given a badge and stuff. Like, you would go into a presentation, and the presentation was to be presented with the T1. Mm-hmm. And so these big robots came out of a stage, and you had something. It was like a tech demo. You were there to see a tech demo. And then all of a sudden, there was all this smoke, and you'd hear the noise, and then a sphere would appear on the screen. And Arnie, would drive out the screen on his bike with John Connor. And all of a sudden, there's a battle on stage, and you're watching this sort of... And then the T-1000 would turn up and all this other stuff. It was crazy. And like you say, there would all be the steam, there'd be stuff blowing on you, your chairs would move as you're shocking. It's totally this. And it was amazing. I don't know, I would love someone to do that and be like, yeah, I'm doing this for a film. There's a feature film that's gonna do this. I think that would be
would
really
too.
cool.
And I sort of worry about one thing that puzzles me is that I like those experiences too, and I worry about sort of film preservation, that we sort of assume that everything, obviously lots of films were lost, but that basically we have a digital version and that preserves the same way that we have a book, right? That preserves, but you wonder sometimes about like, well, you're not making this on vellum anymore, right? Like surely that's changed the impression of the book in some way. It's not the same experience. And some of those movies, like you think even some version of that Terminator ride, people would love to have on home video, even if they couldn't reproduce all of this. And I'm sure that exists somewhere.
It's on YouTube. It's on YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
The whole thing is on YouTube.
Because people filmed it, right?
No, because they closed it down. Universal released for a short time the background video and stuff. It's not great because you're missing the stage performance, but it's worth seeing. 'Cause if you've seen it, you go, "Oh, yeah, that's really cool." But yeah, it's interesting. But it's not the same experience. Like, yeah, you're right. It's totally not the same experience.
Well, eventually, the key thing is eventually we will have virtual reality helmets where we can reproduce all of these experiences, and then it'll be one format again. We'll be able to go through all of that.
I have got, and I don't use it very much because I get uncomfortable watching it. I had one of those Oculus.
Oculus, yeah.
We got one, and I've used it a bit. But because you have the headphones on, you got your thing on your face. And if I was watching something, and I've watched a couple of films on this, very good. If you use Amazon, it looks like you're in a theatre. You can look around and you're in a cinema. Same with Netflix, you're in a log cabin. However, my wife and my daughter, for that matter, also know that I am fully sensory deprivated, and so they will wait till I'm fully invested in a film, and then they'll tickle my feet or poke me or something like that, and it terrifies me. So, like, it swings around about, like, you've got to make sure if you're using one of those virtual reality, you have to trust the people around you, and that's not always, possible.
Yeah, and in your house, it's a dangerous proposition.
It is.
I was also thinking, like when I watched the Tingler, and when they discover that the Tingler, face hugger kind of thing has gone into the loose floorboard and the cinema is below. There's that jolt of joy that I feel of like, oh right, we're gonna have this meta moment, and then the screen goes black and you have the announcer say. Don't be alarmed. The Tingler's, scream for your lives.
Yeah,
that's great. But then, again, times have changed, and I live in a country where, I know a lot of people who are school teachers, and they go through shooter drills every year, and I think about every time I've been in a movie theater since the Dark Knight shootings. I think about the Dark Knight shootings, and I think about what's my point of exit. And they have the, it's like in the old days, they would have the cartoons go like, let's go out to the movies, and it's like the snacks and refreshments that have eyes and are dancing. And now they always have a title that says in the event of an emergency, please locate the exits immediately. And it's like, yeah, you're talking about if we're all gunned down in a mass shooting event. And you're just reminded of that. And so there's a kind of if there is a meta element to the cinema, when that goes dark, there's a part of my brain that goes, oh, that's when the guy in the Joker mask comes out. Right?
Yeah.
So,
oh, no, yeah, no. If you didn't know this, even now, if this played today and you didn't know that's coming, I'm pretty sure that's the one bit that would have a legit. There'd be people that would get legit nervous at that point. Mm-hmm. It's slightly broken when the Tingler creeps across the screen. Still cool, but yes, I totally get what you mean. Could you get away with it today? You'd have to do it as a specific screening, wouldn't you? You'd have to have it as this is set up to do this film. Watching it also reminded me this was replicated, and I'm assuming it's meant to be an homage to this in Gremlins 2.
Yes, yes, yes. I've read about that.
Um,
I don't
and,
remember Gremlins 2 enough to, but
and massively underrated film. But yeah, that breaks. Like at the moment, it has two versions of it. There was the cinema version, and then there was a home video version. And this is completely off track. We'll go back and talk about the Tingler in a moment. But in the Gremlins 2, it breaks and it goes to static and it has the white screen. And then these two Gremlins come up and they start messing with the film, which wouldn't play now. They'd have to play with like flash drives and all kinds of things. But in it, then they get basically it flashes through a bunch of films, and Gremlins have inserted themselves into a series of films, and then they get taken out, I think, by John Wayne at one point in a western, and then it restores back to the other film. There is
that's so
another.
awesome. That's so meta. I mean, it's so
It's
like
amazing. Gremlins 2.
Supreme or something.
Gremlins 2 needs to be revisited. Like as a, it's so underrated. But the other version, though, it gets even weirder. That happens. It cuts out. You see the Gremlins. It then cuts to a cinema foyer where, because this is the home video version, because obviously you're at home now. Cuts to a cinema foyer where someone runs in. They go down to into the screening where you can see this is going on, and they find Hulk Hogan, as in dressed in his wrestling gear, and he cuts a promo on the Gremlins, and basically sort of if the Gremster thinks he can take on the Hulkster, then he can come down here, and he rips his shirt, and then he sort of looks at the camera and says, sorry folks, let's continue with the film, and then the film just carries on.
Wow.
And even as a kid I was like, that's weird. Like, that's
Fight Club has some of that, with the meta stuff of the cigarette burns and coming up, and I love that stuff. I mean, in fact, it was that stuff that convinced me to go see Fight Club in theaters.
It's worth seeing these films in these, and this is the thing, these cinema experiences, because I think it adds to it. I think this is why cinema is important.
Well, and we'll get to it later this season, but the original ending of Little Shop of Horrors with with the plant bursting through the screen.
Yeah,
how awesome! I love these sort of meta moments. But again, that's different on home video, and today it'd be like, I guess you could do like a version of The Ring or something, sort of coming out of your TV.
Yeah, that would be interesting, actually. I don't think they'd do that. But yeah, but let's actually go back and talk about the film. There were one or two moments in this film because I want to visit. So the story of the film, for what it's worth, is Vincent Price is generic scientist, and he is studying fear and also does autopsies. Not sure how they're related, but that's what he does in prisons, no less. And he meets a guy called Ollie. At the prison autopsy, again, people just wandering around with a pass, doesn't make any sense, and they become friends, and he meets Ollie's wife, who is a mute, who also has a fear of blood, and he understands that he sees this, and this event triggers sort of more thoughts in his head about, because of his studies with fear. We then find in his home life he has a loveless marriage, which seems to be a William Castle trait, because it's exactly the same for House on Haunted Hill. And he then has this other partner in science, and they are looking to understand it. And they have found that when you go through a moment of fear, that thing that makes your spine go rigid, that thing that sends all those nerve endings a shudder, is a physical parasite that lives in the human body that grows along your spine as you get more and more scared, called the Tingler. And the only way to stop the Tingler from taking control of your body is to have a catharsis, is to let out a scream when you are scared. This then for somehow encourages Ollie to kill his wife using fear. Not sure of the link on that one, but we'll get to that. And then they actually find a physical Tingler. They capture a Tingler, which then sort of runs rampant in a cinema and goes to the meta moment that we've just talked about. But that's generally it. This whole thing comes down to fear, and yeah, sort of. It has to me, this film. Again, another sort of Vincent Price film, but Vincent Price had a Seth Brundle sort of feel to him about me, like general scientist doing things he probably shouldn't be.
Yeah, and it's weird that he sort of oscillates between like, he goes to the other guy's house and injects the mute, who the mute wife, who, by the way, her husband says is mute and dumb. I was like, she doesn't seem dumb to me. What do you But he goes and injects her without her knowledge, without the husband's knowledge, with a solution to cause her fear. It kills her. I mean, this is, like, clearly this is like a mad scientist. And then at other points, Vincent Price, including at the end, where he discovers that that same guy has used props that you thought were, just hallucinated during her fear sequence. In fact, they were her husband trying to scare her to death. And so, suddenly Vincent Price, having intended to, clearly at least been comfortable with murdering her, not bothered by it at all, now becomes a sort of 50s moralizing character who's like, no matter how you did it, it's still murder. Like, what?
Yeah, he lets him go.
Right.
Because he actually says, I could go downstairs and call, because he's got the gun trained on him. Ollie's has the gun trained on him. And he says, all I could do is go downstairs and call the police. And then he sort of just walks out, sort of giving it this sort of like, disappointed shake of the head, like, oh, Ollie. And you think, did you call the police? I don't think so.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is, like, he's performing autopsies without the police ever being called. Like, I know you're a pathologist, but I've got to think that even in 1959, when you call the police and the police show up and are like, her entire back has been removed, you've cut along her spine, pulled out enormous amounts of material. What the hell have you done to this body? Before it's been given to the actual medical examiner. I
did like that. That is the very sort of like, they bring it in and he's like, well, you can do autopsies. He's like, yes, I can. And he's sort of like, yeah, but there's clearly a procedure to this. Like, mad scientists. I love it. I do also like, one of the things I like about this is this 50s thing that sort of we've seen a bit of, is scientists just being scientists. Like, that's their job. And all of them seem to have a laboratory in their basement, and that they have their work at home. I'm not entirely sure how it gets funded, or like who's doing this. But it sort of seems to address it in this film, where he's like, oh no, I married this rich woman, and I married into this rich family, and I used her money. And again, like, throughout this film, we were funny enough, we sort of talked about this a little bit before we were talking that we started recording. Is Vincent Price the villain in this film? Because he does things that are almost villainous, like you say, and then sort of doesn't. But he has a charisma throughout it. Like, I really enjoy Vincent Price. But like, there are moments when, like you say, when he seems to be suggesting, like, oh yeah, no, I'm going to kill a woman who can't scream to see what happens. And also, like, I've sent somebody out to go find a cat in an alleyway just so he can do some experiments on it. And I'm like, are you the baddie in this? I'm not sure. Like, is this 50s cent morality that is slightly different to now? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, he is the sort of Victor Frankenstein at that point. And it's funny, we see the cat in the cage, but he never comes back. Like, you keep thinking, like, oh, that cat's going to be important at the end. Yeah. It's going to capture the Tingler or something. Nope, never going to come back. No, right. And this sort of mad scientist thing, I mean, he's literally he's doing human medical experiments, right? They don't even do an animal experiment. They're just like cut straight to the human. And he's chosen a handicapped woman, as his victim, precisely because she has less power and can't complain. Like, this is, especially, in a more woke era, this is even worse than it would have been seen in 1959. Yeah. I mean, talk about preying on the weak. But and the fact that the husband also intended to kill her and says, this thing about ruined marriages, bad marriages is fascinating, because he says, oh, trust me, my wife tried to kill me many times. It's like, what happened in Castle's home life?
I want to know. I have agreed. I want to go and look at his wiki page because I think he must have had multiple people try and kill him because that same line is used in House on Haunted Hill. There's a line there where Vincent Price and the wife there. Vincent Price is like, "Do you remember that time you tried to poison me? What fun we had!" And you're like, "Yeah, what's your like baseline for marriage? Like, I want to understand this." But yeah, in this, like the. Again, like the moment when he finds out, they find out, or they sort of surmise that the way to sort of, you have this feeling, you have to have this catharsis, you have to scream. They figured this out to some extent, through whatever. And then when they find this, they meet this mute woman, and they're discussing it. And Vincent Price is like, yes, well, if someone couldn't scream, I wonder what would happen. Interesting. And there's that sort of like, that sort of like, I've just coincidentally met a mute woman. I wonder what would happen. And it's clear, like you say, they have a fear poison, don't they? Basically, sort of like Scarecrow's fear toxin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I believe he was just going to inject her with that and see what would happen. But still, that would be against her will.
Of course.
So
yeah, he does. He gives it to her, right? That's why she has got that hallucination and stuff.
Yeah.
And then he gets dosed with it later when his wife, finds it on a table and then puts it in his brandy. But it seems to only make him pass out.
Well, I think that's supposed to be just like she just drugged him to.
Try to kill him.
Yeah, I think she was intending to kill him because she brings the Tingler in, doesn't she, to throttle him?
Yeah. The Tingler attacks instead of he has any hallucination.
But because he injects himself with it and has that very dramatic moment where he's sort of, he's trying not to scream. He's letting the fear build up and trying to report on it.
So let's get into the mechanics of that a little because, obviously it's all absurd, right? I mean, the idea that like when you see the sort of the Tingler who's sort of like a centipede, that's like 2 feet long or something, you would see this massive bulge in somebody's spine. And of course, like, where did this come from? Did this like evolve with humans as a symbiote or something? Never addressed. It grows. The fear causes it to like spontaneously grow to this size. I mean, obviously none of this really makes sense. But then I question, like, if that woman can't, I mean, this whole screaming thing is a delightful conceit, right? Because it's like, that audience participation. It's like, can Peter Pan fly? Is it Tinkerbell, right? You've got to believe that Tinkerbell can fly, everybody in the audience has to believe. So this idea of like the scream is catharsis. I guess we're left to believe that mute, like when she saw that blood early on, and she sort of faints, the Tingler grew inside her spine, and it's just never going down. Like the thing about being a mute is your Tingler just keeps growing and growing until it kills you. That's just part of being a mute, apparently.
But fear doesn't work that way. Like you might right. see that and go, but when the blood is taken away, like the phobia leaves, like you return back to calm. So does it not just return? So could you not kill it with, get rid of it with meditation or?
Well, I mean, that's the gimmick, right? I mean, and that's kind of charming. But of course, as you say, that's not. I've been in a lot of messed up situations. None of them have I ever screamed. If I scream, it's usually the last time I was remembering being in New Zealand and a mouse ran across my foot trying to escape a cat, and I went, ah, but when I've been in car wrecks and stuff and approached people who were seriously injured, I've never screamed, but it seems just it's oriented around that cinema experience, right? It's all about getting you in the audience to feel at liberty, right, in society to scream, right, to do this audience participation. And real horror junkies, like, I am not a real horror junkie, but people I've known who, they just will go see any horror movie in the theaters. They love the fear, and they love, you can screaming and grabbing the person next to them.
It's that roller coaster experience, isn't it? Like, and that's the thing. I mean, again, what's interesting as well is about the elevation of where we have come from and where we're at now. That 1959, this film. I mean, that dream sequence or that fear sequence. The two moments that are in it we talked about is she turns the faucets on and the water comes out. It's bright red and looks like blood. She turns around and the bathtub's full of blood because she has a phobia of blood, and that's the thing we've just got to be clear. And a hand comes out of it and it's drenched in blood. I mean, to be fair, like in a fully black and white film, and I'd forgotten about this scene, for it to come up and then is actually quite striking, and it's incredibly well done. But all that moment like that would have been relatively shocking, I think, in 59. This is the year before Psycho, so Psycho came out the next year, and people fainted at Psycho. People were really affected by it. And then 10 years or 15 years after that, or 30 years, people were sick and fainted at The Exorcist. And you elevate. You watch this now and you go, it's kind of quaint. It's very like it's not hugely shocking. It's not going to go. I mean, I wouldn't show it to Ellie. She's only 8, but like, not far off. Like, there's nothing in this I would say is hugely horrifying. But in 59, I think it would have been. It makes me wonder, like, if you took a film back now, some of the films that people tip back Hereditary or something like that really sort of bother people. Make them watch that in 59. I think you'd have people's heads exploding. But
well, I play Saw for my son every year, and now he's on his 6th birthday. I just want him to be prepared.
That's the Saw birthday tradition. Yeah, but that's what interests me is, like I say, that that thing of screaming and being scared, and like it's just the fun of it, because I think part of the screaming would be laughter as well, wouldn't it? It would be all, there'd be shocks and frights, but it's that release, literal catharsis of that. Oh my god, we're safe. You're safe. There's no Tingler escaped in the cinema, but it's in that moment. We want that fear. I always think about scare mazes.
Yeah.
I've been to those. I love scare mazes. I love a good scare maze. And in that moment when you're being hunted down by zombies, or acted as zombies, or killer clowns or whatever it is, like, my heart is pounding. I know I'm completely safe. Like, I know nothing's going to happen. But like, you're so in the moment. And I think that's sort of, again, it's that sort of idea of you do scream, and like you say, it's that social acceptance of being able to do that and be like, and then laugh and go, "Oh my god, don't be silly." But yeah, I think all that stuff's really cool. I think that's one of the reasons I kind of like these films.
Yeah, and I find listening to you, I'm thinking about the role of the theater, whether it's a real cinema or it's the scare maze or haunted house or whatever, as a sort of social environment, and the way in which we react or don't react or expect other members of the audience to react or not react, and there is, especially like you go to see a movie on opening night, there is this kind of like camaraderie. Like, we did Rocky Horror earlier. I mean, I feel that camaraderie in Rocky Horror. And different movies in different cultures have different rules about, talking during movies and whatever. I tend to be one of those people who, like, I am annoyed at, like, the old person behind me who I just hear his breath constantly. And I'm just like, oh my God, I want to focus on the movie, and I'm constantly annoyed by this. And then I'm constantly annoyed by people having a good time. And I'm, like, I'll go see a Star Wars movie and I'll be like, yeah, that's a great shot. And then, we'll go into some scene that means absolutely nothing to me. And I hear like gasps from the audience. And I'm like, you guys are fucking lemmings,
Yeah.
Like, just, I hate it. I hate that sort of thing so much. And I tend to be fearful of crowds. I tend to be, I like crowds outside, but I tend to be like, I hate going to concerts
Mm.
because it's, I'm listening and I think, yeah, those notes are okay. Like it's not as good as it is on the recording, and everybody's just like dancing in the aisles, and I'm like, yeah, we're all crazy right now. Like that
Yeah.
part of our brain that just goes with the madness of crowds and is part of a riot on the streets and just assaults somebody and breaks windows, and then you ask them later and they're like, I didn't make a conscious decision at all. That social thing in our brains, that animal lizard part of our brains just kicks in, and I'm terrified of that.
Mm.
So for me, I don't like being scared as much. I'm part of why I like my analysis is so based on sort of taking things apart, right?
Mm.
And so I'm the guy who sits watching comedy and doesn't laugh, and I'm like, okay, I saw 3 moves ago what you were going for. I'm not really laughing at this, or I'll laugh 3 moves ahead when everybody's not laughing and they look at me like I'm an alien because I see what they're setting up, and it's mechanical for me. So I see like the jump scare, and I'm like, I don't want to sit in a room with somebody just going like shoving their hands at me.
It works.
I have a weird relationship with these.
But I think the thing is, you're right about the camaraderie, that thing of going on. Because I've been to films where there's no atmosphere. Like there'll be a group of people in there, but it's like it falls flat. And you're watching it, and in your head you go, "Yeah, it's not a bad film. It's not a bad film." And then I could go and watch that same film, and there could be a buzz in the audience, and that elevates that film. All of a sudden you're like, actually, this is really good. I've had examples of that. I went to see. You say about that. I'm one of the lemmings in many cases. I give into my. You say reptile brain. I think Martian. I give into the Martian part of my brain.
Is that a Quatermass in the pit?
That's my Quatermass. But like you say, I remember going to see Avengers Endgame, and I was one of the people that when it pans across and you see that Cap's holding that Thor's hammer, he's holding Mjolnir. I'm there. I'm cheering. I was all in on that, and luckily I wasn't alone. Otherwise, I think I'd have been marched out. But the crowd went mental. It was a packed cinema, and everyone was watching, and it was like ah. But then I've also been, in cinemas where we've been to horror films. I recently went to see The Conjuring 3. It's all right. It's not a bad film, not a great film, but there was an atmosphere. The film was, the cinema wasn't packed. It wasn't busy because of social distancing and stuff. And it was relatively good, but there was a lot of people that were like, "This is my first film back in the cinema. I'm excited. There's a buzz." And because of that feeling, like some of the jump scares that any other film, I think I'd have been a bit like, it's all right, it's fine. But for this film, I was like, oh yeah, that really got me. That really sort of hit me. And so it works. I think there is that. I went to one experience I had. I went to see a re-screening of Terminator 2 a couple of years ago when it was re-released. They did the 4K re-release and stuff, and Jim Cameron redid some of the special effects and just tweaked things and stuff to make sure it didn't look crap in 4K. And I went to re-see it, and I love that film. I've seen that film tens of times. And watching it on the big screen, though, again, with a crowd of people that were like, "Oh, I can get to see Terminator 2 on the big screen," was almost like watching it for the first time. And so you're watching that chase, the lorry chase, and then when Arnie comes off on his bike, comes off into the Los Angeles sort of river things, and then circles around the side of the lorry, your heart's pounding. And I'm just like, I've seen this dozens of times. I know exactly what's going to happen and how this all pans out. But this is awesome. And I do think there's something about that when you're in a crowd and people are buzzing, it just seems to elevate things. And I think that's a part of what this film's tapping into. It's trying to get that blood pumping, that adrenaline, that adrenalization of like, oh yeah, you're at an event. This is something to enjoy. And I think that has it's important. And I think some of that is lost a little bit. Mm-hmm. People forget that cinema is an experience. And not to sort of said I'm smarter than Scorsese, but when he's like, "Oh, I don't like Marvel films because they're a roller coaster," I'm like, "Yeah, That's why you go to see them. That's the point. You know, that's not saying his films aren't any lesser. I love his films, but that's the point.
Yeah, see, I mean, I agree with Scorsese. I mean, you know, not obviously word for word. There's just factual inaccuracies there. But I mean, I don't have that roller coaster experience. And my reaction 95% of the time is always to feel like I'm the outsider. You know, when I'm in those concerts and people are dancing, I think if the person came on stage right now and said some Nazi stuff, everybody would just be like, "Yeah, that makes sense. Let's get those Jews." And that terrifies me. That, and I know that that's a part of our brains, and that terrifies me. Being in an audience where I'm, you know, all I need is that guy to come up to the microphone and say, "See that weirdo back there, you know, in the trench coat? You know, he is an artsy fartsy intellectual. Let's get him." And I'm dead. So you know, my relationship, probably I would have hated this in 1959, because my relationship is when I see, you know, it's like, you know, even when I see other people having too much fun, and it's more fun than I think is justified. You know, like they're just like, we should be having fun together, but it's like they're enjoying it too much. I think something's wrong with them. Like, you know, I'm glad that they're having fun, but I can't get there. What's wrong with me? And I've had so many experiences. Like, usually my experience watching a Marvel movie, at least half of them is, and it's not just Marvel movies. I mean, I just saw Wonder Woman 1984. I mean, a lot of my experiences watching movies is feeling trapped, feeling miserable, feeling like I have to finish this. I'm not enjoying this. I'm getting angry that this was made for this amount of money. I'm angry that other people like this and pretend that this is genius. You know, certainly the case in the Marvel movies. And I'm angry about these things. I'm angry about the stupidity. I'm angry that this is acceptable, and I'm angry at the jump scares and the like I haven't seen it, but I would probably get, you know, I might go for it, but I might get to that point with Thor's hammer and say, yeah, okay, yeah, this is a signifier that only means something in your, you know, dumb F universe. And, you know, we all saw it coming, and now you push that button and everybody goes, whoa, whoa. And I just feel like, okay, I'm out. I'm out. You people have fun. Scream your head off in the dark, you know.
And yet I make you watch. We watch films on a fortnightly basis. And there's at least a couple in this season I'm probably going to feel bad about now.
Why?
I'm making you watch Demolition Man.
Oh no, you know, but I'm very forgiving. This is one reason I'm very forgiving of bad movies, as long as they are, you know, I mean, I think I'm very forgiving of just sort of fun movies that might have a few flaws or whatever. It's that social aspect. It's that, you know, I guess you know, my fear is not the Tingler crawling up my leg. In the audience, right? I'll deal if that happens. I will deal with it. My fear is the people next to me.
So if you were sat next to one of those sort of like the plants, one of those people that was put in by Castle to do that, to jump and scream and stuff like that, you know, it would have resulted in more irritation for you than you know, joined in sort of the fear.
Well, not to talk too much about my reaction, but I mean, you know, watching horror movies, there are those moments, like you were saying, like you really feel that tension, and I'm not immune from it. I feel that tension, and I'm like, okay, the character's going down a hospital corridor, something's going to jump out, right? And then it fakes you out and fakes you out until it finally delivers when you don't expect it, right? So I know that formula. So now I'm just watching it and I'm just girding myself, because I'm like, it is manipulating me. I refuse to be manipulated. And then there are people next to me who I could hear them breathing. I hear them, you know, ready to scream. Sometimes they're screaming, and I can feel the way that is causing my nervous energy to increase. And I feel resentful of them for putting that nervous energy on me. Instead of feeling camaraderie, I feel like I'm in an office and somebody just came up to me and said, you know, I've got these reports I don't quite have time to finish, Bob. You know, like you're putting something on me. I don't need to feel that way.
No, I know what you mean. I do appreciate that, and it's interesting that. But you'll go to the Rocky Horror performances, and I'm assuming it's the ones that the sing along ones where it's the bobbing ball on the lyrics and stuff, and people are all in costume, and that's a camaraderie. I mean, is that a different event? Are you in?
I think you make a decision to participate, right?
Yes,
like when we hit that black screen in the Tingler, I'm like, I kind of want to scream. But then I make a logical, analytic decision, right? I'm like, do I scream? Do I resent that I'm being asked? Like, I resent, I mean, there's that stupid song, I can make your hands clap. Go F yourself. Don't tell me what to do, okay? I hate when people on stage say, all right, repeat after me, like, I'm confident. No, don't tell me what to do, I'm not your minion. So I have that resistance to this. And at the same time, it's like I kind of want to shout and give in and be part of this and see if I can just relax and enjoy it.
No, you're right though. I think there's that thing of forced participation. On this, I totally get that. Especially you mentioned The Office. That thing where it's sort of like, and now we're going to have an office quiz or a team meeting quiz. And you're like, oh, bollocks. Like, I don't want, what do you mean you're not coming to the Christmas party? You're like, I don't want to. Like, I see you all at work every day. Like, I like a lot of the people I work with, but like, it's these things, and and I've had that in the past where like one of the places I worked at previously, that exact thing. One of the senior managers, what do you mean you're not coming to the Christmas party? Like, well, I'm away that weekend. I can't do anything about it. But there is that force, and that moment, I am so the same with that. The moment someone's like forcing you to say things like, enjoy this. And I'm like, I don't want to know. You've taken the joy out of it, really, by enforcing it. But yeah, I think with this thing, I kind of like the idea. Thing is, it's that thing of the meta-ness of this. So I really enjoy the fourth dimension, and a story I was listening to on the special features. There's a story of when this was released. Vincent Price would often go with Castle when they would do some of the screenings, and he would sneak in and watch them and stuff like that. And on one of these, he saw these two women sat at the back, or young, teenagers or whatever. These two ladies sat watching, thoroughly enjoying it, and it was screaming and all kinds of things, and they're all involved. And Vincent would snuck into the row behind them, and just as the film ended, he leaned in between them and said, "My dears, I hope you enjoyed yourselves." Apparently, these two women just absolutely threw a fit and ran out. this very distinctive Vincent Price voice just appearing out, between you, terrified them. So,
especially with the hallucinations in the film.
Yes.
And if you're at this heightened state of sort of terror, or fear, I guess there's no legitimate reason. But you turn around and you would imagine Vincent Price is there in the audience. You're like, what is going on?
This 6'5" Vincent Price is leering at you. I love that story. But yeah, this idea, of this film. Oh, one thing I was going to ask actually before we get on to is the end of this film. Because the film is not supernatural in any way. It's very much sort of like a science sort of base. Is Tingler supposed to be a scientific discovery? It's a parasite that lives in us. And there's obviously murder and mayhem involved. But the body of Oliver's wife is returned. And he comes home, and we've seen her sit up because the Tingler's we assume it's because the Tingler is in her spine still, so that's why he gets out. But this film ends with the body that's already been through an autopsy. Like, we've had the Tingler removed, so she's definitely dead. Her body sits up and walks towards him. And every time I see this, I'm like, I don't know what I'm supposed. Is it just another sort of like a little sort of like dig at the audience? Is it supposed to be like one final scare, whatever? But I'm like, it doesn't play into the film. It bothers me a little bit because it doesn't feed into anything else that's gone before.
I agree with you, and I think it's ambiguous as to what's causing that. Is it the Tingler? I mean, at first when she set up earlier, I thought, oh, this is just because this happens after death,
Yeah.
right? The body moves as it outgassing occurs, and muscles flax and things like this. Bodies move around when they're dead, and that's creepy enough without a weird a symbiotic caterpillar, in the spine. And so, yeah, at the end, I had the same thought, and I thought, okay, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, at this point, the movie has failed to really keep track of its characters. It has not really resolved like what's going on with his wife trying to kill him, and his wife being asked to give half her money to her sister, who then like shows up and then is gone. And at this point, I just felt like, okay, clearly I know what this movie is. None of that mattered. What really matters is the scare, and this is just one last scare, right?
Yeah, it is. It's yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, the thing is, you could probably even reduce the cast in this film, because the assistant, the scientist assistant and the sister, or his fiance, whatever, don't really serve any great purpose in this film, like at all, other than to sort of give commentary on a couple of scenes when like Vincent Price is doing the fear thing, is to sort of give some commentary. That's about it. And they also sort of offer the fact that there's you have these two bad marriages, and then that's quite interesting. That's the one thing I did think is interesting. You've got these two bad marriages and this young couple, and you have like Vincent Price going like, even despite everything that's gone on with us, like, no, they're young and they can make this a go of this, and he still seems relatively optimistic. But everybody else is like, no, marriage is crap, and when you get old, you always end up with these people. It's like, I don't know what 50s like etiquette would be around this, but I'm still like, if you hate each other that much, I'm sure divorce was still available. Like she could divorce him. There's nothing stopping her. She's obviously, she's out every night with another man and all this other stuff. Like, it seems they're trying to portray her as a villain almost. But I'm still, but again, I'm like, well, yeah, but he's dedicated to his career. He's obviously abandoned her. Like, she's looking for some solace. Like, she's looking to get some reaction out of him in some way. Like, I sort of don't blame her, to be honest.
Well, I thought that was fascinating because you see her kiss her date, right? At least one of her paramours, if not the only one, outside before coming in. And there's, Vincent Price comes in and she enters through the back door of the house, and he says, "Oh, that's perfectly normal," and finds this sort of like tie clip, and there's some sort of interesting dialogue about like, he says, "Oh, it's not my style," and she says, "Oh, yes, it is." It's like, what's that really mean? I don't know. But I like those elements. I think they're fascinating. I think to a audience in '59, the fact that she is having sex with other men is just a no-go, right? I mean, she's just a villain at that point. There's no sympathizing with her from that mentality. And then she's portrayed as quite conniving and lying. But I think what makes it really evil is that she is at her most murderous. She is simultaneously the kindest and sweetest. And so it's this sort of like stereotypical female Two-Face, like, thing of like, watch out for women, you don't know what their real emotions are. When they're at their sweetest, that's when they're the most deadly, sort of femme fatale figure. But then that isn't important to the plot, and he is both horrible and kind. I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't even get resolved.
No.
But yeah,
that's the real horror, though. I mean, incidentally, like that is an existential horror for me. It's like I have known people in happy marriages that improved their lives, but I've also known people whose lives were destroyed by bad choices in partners, or just bad, their partner going crazy.
Yeah.
Things that you couldn't justify, like, well, they could have made a better choice. And that is terrifying. That is a real horror.
Yeah,
Like,
and I think there is that thing of like, I say flippantly that she could just leave him, but obviously, in real life, that's not always an option and that sort of thing. But Patricia Cutts, who plays the wife, like she's clearly having fun. Like she's actually really good at being this sort of like, really getting to being this villain, like you say, being conniving, and some of the dialogue she has is really good. And I mean, Vincent Price says at one point, he says that you hear the story of the man who comes home and he says to his wife, "Why is it every time I open the front door I hear the back door close?" And she says to him, "Oh dear, it's just your paranoia." And it's just the way she delivers her lines is absolutely fantastic. It's really sort of fun to watch this sort of like venomous relationship between the pair of them. And so yeah, I do see that they're sort of obviously like making her out to be the villain, but I can't help but sort of go like, you're actually just fun to watch. I kind of like you when you're on screen. You're really good. So yeah, it's difficult, and also the fact is, it's her family's money.
right.
He's married in so that he can finance his science or his scientific discoveries and a scientific career, and then has abandoned her pretty much.
Yeah.
And like you say, he's then cruel, and he sort of because he pretends to shoot her to get a fear reaction to see how that to see how she reacts, and then uses her as an experiment. He's no better. Like we've said this before about there's no heroes in some of the films or no protagonists, but like pretty much everybody in this film does something a little bit where you're like, yeah.
Yeah, and he sort of pretends to shoot her. She faints. This is all very strange.
Yeah.
You don't know that it's blanks. Initially, you think, well, there's no wound, there's no blood, but maybe that's a sort of convention of cheap filmmeting.
Yeah.
And then he X-rays her, and just quite an extended sequence as he gets behind the metal to protect himself. X-raying her spine to find the parasite that he has caused to grow inside her. Like, this is all insane.
And she doesn't scream; she just comes to.
Right, but he seems to justify it by like, look, she is a bad person.
Yeah,
and so at that point, you already know she's a bad person. So I think we're supposed to sort of feel more justified that he's experimenting on her. But then he kills a mute.
He was planning
straight
to
up murder. So
yeah, he's planning to kill somebody else, and that's where I think this film would have worked better if it had been the sort of the Seth Brundle fall from grace. Sort of like, oh, I found this thing, I know it exists, but to prove its existence, I need to do this terrible thing, and I know that's not what this film is. I get that, but as a film, like if it was to be this scientist's sort of just fall from grace and then to result in this thing with the Tingler, would have been a bit stronger. Because I'm never entirely sure, like you say, the dropped line about the husband and wife, Ollie and his wife, the two Higginses, them trying to kill each other. It's just bizarre. Like they run a silent movie theater. They appear to make a lot of money from doing it, which I'm pretty sure probably wouldn't be the case.
I'm not sure how much money they make. I mean, they kind of bitch about the conditions,
Yeah.
They don't seem especially happy with it. I mean, they never talk about like the joy of the cinema. They're playing old. I mean, this is one of those like, B movie theaters that, is just trying to stay afloat in. It's interesting because if you see this as another sort of, aspect of the meta commentary, that the film itself is this play on, the spectacle, right, on that response to television. But it features within its plot the cinema that then becomes the meta stand-in for the audience in the theater, is a small-time cinema that plays silent movies and is exactly on the opposite end of the spectrum from the expensive spectacle houses that could install these kinds of devices.
Yeah, it sort of moves away from that. I mean, yeah, that's true. I mean, one of the weird things I just thought is that there's no television shown in, you know, because you see, like I say, that I wouldn't have thought that the Higgins would have had a television, but yeah, like showing, you know, the Vincent Price and his wife, you know, the Chapmans having a television or something. That's the sort of house you'd expect it. But yeah, there's no sort of mention of it or recognition of it, which is interesting. One thing you did say about the silent cinema, one of the things I wanted to mention was, I've lost the damn thing now. It's called. There is actually a silent film in this, or at least inserted as part of the cinema sequence at the end, which is interesting to see that people are going to see it. It's a film called Tall Able David from 1921, which is a western.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was quite surprised at, because I'm not really up on my silent cinema, I know very little, you know, sort of the ones that everyone sort of knows. That film, Tall Able David, the scenes you see is basically sort of like there seems to be like three men in a cabin in a western setting, like. And at one point, I swear that the guy's got like, his arms like drenched in blood and he's covered in bullet shots. I'm like, that film seemed more violent than this in 1959, and I'm like, that film's from 1921. Like, it's really interesting how spectacle of cinema has changed. But that film, you know, there's a fight scene and I don't know what did you take anything from the silent cinema scenes, the silent film?
I think that's a fascinating question. I mean, as far as the violence, my guess is that film is pre-Hays Code. So,
Yes,
you know,
yeah,
the early silent stuff could basically get away with a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, they were like replacing those like kinetoscopes that like you could go to a pier and like you could watch some naked women together or something. You know, with the little like a Viewmaster.
They called it What the Butler Saw. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right, exactly. And those were quite popular. I remember seeing one as a kid at the Jersey Shore. Yeah, I found that I wondered about that, and I thought that it's another one of those like delicious or potentially delicious meta moments, right? Where you're in the cinema, and you're being shown the cinema, you know, clearly the Tingler is loose in the cinema. And I love watching movies in movies. Yeah. I love that kind of stuff. But I wasn't sure, like, what is the commentary? You know, like Tarantino would do this, and it would be, you know, all very meta and sort of like you'd see the juxtaposition of the people, you know, like Vincent Price searching for the Tingler in the audience, along with, you know, some sort of clear parallel on screen. And there doesn't seem to be any parallel at all. I mean, in fact, Westerns, you know, were, you know, often defined by sort of black and white morality, and insider outsider groups, you know, the white brave men versus, you know, white criminals or, you know, Native Americans or, you know, very binary. And yet there's no black and white morality in this movie. We're just talked about how everybody's. So I could not figure out any kind of clever meta commentary there.
Everyone seems to know what the film is. Like, I was able to sort of see that the people have said, "Oh, it's Tall Able David is the film," but everyone's sort of gone. It sounds a bit like it was available at the time.
Yeah.
You know, William Castle's gone. What's cheap? What hasn't got right? What hasn't got rights attached to it? Oh, this one, great. Put that in. And that's probably what it is. You know, there's probably a thing of. I'm assuming there would be things if you're using, even from a form of film, like if you're using an actor's likeness, you know, there's got to be some sort of royalty rights or something. So they're probably like, well, this guy's dead, or he's sort of.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, you know, I think it was very rare in this period, you know, for except for big stars to have any kind of points on films. And you know, I do know that, like, I mean, Charlton Heston was one of the people who really, you know, his whole career was defined by taking less. He had an agent apparently who told him the thing to do is to take less money so you never price yourself out of the market and just get points on everything. Be like, I'll take half a salary, give me 1% on the back end. And that worked for him. But I think that in general, there was a very work for hire era.
Well,
I think they could have just done whatever the hell they wanted.
Yeah, probably. I mean, there was that whole thing of like contracts. You were contracted to a studio, weren't you? That sort of thing, and you did so many years for them, and they're trying to get as many films out of you as possible.
And plus morality clauses, where they would have for the big stars. I mean, it was like back, Fatty Arbuckle way back in the day, where you would have the studio come in and clean up messes. You'd be caught like somebody would take a photo of you with your mistress, and the studio goes and speaks to that person and pays them off, and that's just as if they're in charge of your public image.
I know that Errol Flynn. There's a lot of those stories with Errol Flynn, and I don't know how far they go, but he was, he was a philanderer at the best of times. So, I always find it when they call it like the golden age of cinema, and it was like, is that golden age? It was always like this first year. It was called the golden age. It's not really the best age, though, is it? Like, it's clear there was like, it was probably a horrible place to be for some people.
Well, even stars. I mean, you think what they were subjected to. I mean, we're talking about an era where, like, when you see images of horses falling off a cliff, those are real horses they killed, right? I mean, that was just how it was done back then, and they just put guys on top of those horses. They put people in horrible situations. Remember the pilot for the Star Trek, where No Man Has Gone Before? There was permanent damage from those contacts. There were metal contacts that were way thicker than like a modern contact. They forced the actors to like put this in their eyeballs, and just the paint all over their bodies, and lead, and nobody cared. It was just like, look, do you want this job or not? And so it was not a good era.
No, not a golden age at all, really. It is interesting, though. One final sort of point I want to make is this idea of fear of sort of like, we've gone through the 50s, and in the next episode we're going to do a bit of a reflection on this bulk, really, sort of like, this block of films we've looked at. But sci-fi and horror in particular, we've touched on a little bit in this time, really changes. Like, something seems to change at this point. Like, from 60 onwards, you start to get a very different. You get Psycho, then you get sort of Rosemary's Baby and Peeping Tom. All these other films start to come out in the 60s, and these films of the 50s seem to get left behind. Even the sci-fi, the sort of the 60s, is very different. I mean, we by 60. When was Star Trek? 66?
Yeah, 66, 67. I think is that first.
Yeah. So
yeah, 66.
I mean, that's television, really, but still, you have this this idea of science fiction starts to really change in the 60s, and this film taps into that idea with the meta thing of, like, say, what you said about TV and this other thing. It's aware. It seems very self-aware that it's like, we're at the end of an era, and we are holding on to something. We really are trying to hold on to this past era, this past idea of what these films are and what this era was and what cinema is, and it passes into something very new, and you get a whole bunch of different new filmmakers in the 60s. And you have more spectacles, you have more auteurism, but I often thinking about this as a transition film. Let's spend a minute and sort of talk about sci-fi as a genre, because science fiction is, whatever. I mean, anything's a genre if you say it's a genre, right? I mean, what defines it? Certain tropes, but they're not. You can have a sci-fi western, you can have a sci-fi adventure story, you can have sci-fi realism where it's just a you could follow Vincent Price and his wife, and the only thing that's going on is, like, you see the Tingler in the background and it's a sci-fi element. I mean, and really
some films, that's the most fascinating thing. It's sort of like how do these people deal with their normal lives in this sci-fi setting? So in some ways, like sci-fi isn't a genre. It's a collection of elements that are or are not present. And in some ways, that's why I love sci-fi so much, is you can do anything with it, right? It's not limited. Like a Western has to basically be in the Old West, right? There are certain, you're limited in a way. Sci-fi, basically, you need something that is not supernatural, but is an extension of currently known science. And as long as you have that one element, basically, there's a sci-fi element. But it seems to me that sci-fi is, in the 60s, it's more defined as a genre. Now, when we finished our 60s block, the first 60s movie is Eyes Without a Face, which is really just, they can do a face transplant. That's the only sci-fi element. There's no aliens. So it's more like, it's closer to the Tingler in that sense. But it seems to me, with that aside, when you get to stuff like 2001, I mean, that is a sci-fi movie. Really, most of these 50s movies, like Them, what is Them? It's really a monster movie, right? With sci-fi elements. And I mean, the same thing is true, like, Frankenstein, that's clearly sci-fi, but I think of it primarily as horror, as a monster movie. And so I think that sci-fi was more, at least in cinema, was more sort of inchoate. I think in all of these movies, like it's a blend, it's an element that's there along with these other genres. And it's really starting in the 60s. I mean, it's present obviously before. I mean, some of the most fantastic stuff. I mean, Forbidden Planet, one of my favorites. That's a straight up science fiction movie, and that's earlier than this. But I think that over time, more and more sci-fi sort of becomes its own genre and sort of diverges. And so when you get to the 60s, it feels different in part because this 50s stuff, which we love, is more like, bam, bam, pow, let's make an exciting movie. Sure. I mean, going to the moon or whatever is just thrown in as part of a disaster movie. It's, whereas in the 60s, that happens, but it becomes more defined as a genre with its own tropes that you couldn't just take those sci-fi elements out and replace them, with supernatural or something else and have the same movie.
Yeah, they're more of a pure element. It's more of a pure representation of that genre. That's what you're saying. I mean, to me, I agree. I think that's an interesting point because I think I have this theory that exists in my brain that sort of, I have these theories, but is it? Yeah, we both have these things, but this one is basically that no film is a single genre. Like, it's that turntable, it's that sort of editor's table again. You move things up and down, but everything has got a secondary genre. Like you say, like the sci-fi horror, the sci-fi comedy, the sci-fi whatever. But then you can also flip them. That thing of like saying, it's a comedy sci-fi. Like, the predominant genre is comedy. Like, this is set up for laughs, but it's in a sci-fi environment. And the same with horror, like you say, science fiction horror. Alien is a really good example. Is in it's a sci-fi horror film, but could you transplant that entire that story somewhere else? Yeah, of course you could. I mean, that could literally be. You could do that about truckers picking up something, some kind of monster at a warehouse, and it, or something. There are numerous ways of doing it, but it's still a science fiction horror. It's in space, and then you get those. But then you get the turntable where you probably zap one up, and even for westerns, I mean, it's location based. You couldn't, initially I would say that westerns were location based. They had the reason they were called westerns is because they took place on the west part of America for the most part. Like there was a whole subgenre called southerns, apparently, which had things like Django in and these other things. Even apparently suggested the spaghetti westerns are sort of more like southerns than they are westerns. But But you get that idea. But now you get like an urban western, or you can get a sci-fi western. I think like High Noon is a really good example that got transplanted and became Outland. Or, you know, I mean, sci-fi seems to love that. Sometimes takes western tropes and just says, "Do you know what would be really cool? Rio Bravo in space. Go do that," and you get a sci-fi western. So, you know, they become the concepts, and I think so. I agree with what you're saying, but there's that sort of turntable of where they ramp one up, and sci-fi definitely has that. Where you go like, "Oh, this is all 90% sci-fi, but there's still that 10% which is another genre." And like you say, so you can't take away the sci-fi because it's fully sci-fi. But that's really confidence. That's about a confidence. I think, no, we are going full on science fiction, and 2001 is a really good example of that, because you can't take out the sci-fi elements. But there's others where you go 50-50. You could probably transplant some of that and move it to Earth or whatever. But I find that fascinating when they do that, when you see films and people all debate it. Like, there was a woman from, I believe, The Guardian recently that said she doesn't believe that science fiction, that horror can be in space. And you sort of scratch your head and go, but these things don't have to be location based. It's about how you set them up. And I think science fiction is one of those great ones. As like you say, you could have a film like Primer, which is a really sort of small, low budget film where the sci-fi is, you know, is a major part of that. But the other part of that is actually it's a film about a bunch of friends that start to have a disagreement about a business venture.
Yeah.
And,
well,
you know,
I mean, I think that the thing is that, you know, people confuse. I remember back in the day, and people still make this error about like confusing medium with genre, right?
Yes.
It was like the medium is a comic book. The comic book does not equal superhero. The genre is superhero.
Yeah.
But I think you're right that everything has multiple genres. I think that's correct. I think that, like you were talking about, you know, transplanting the Western, or, you know, I mean, this absurd notion that you can't have horror in space, right? Yeah. I mean, sometimes people get too caught up in the definition of a genre, right? So when you talk about like a Western, well, the classic Western, we haven't made a classic Western for 40, 60 years. I mean, that classic Western was filled with revisionist history, overwhelmingly white male protagonists who, you know, are the sole defender of law and order, and, you know, very black and white morality. Obviously, spaghetti Western upsets that. But, you know, the sort of classic Western was very much that sort of, you know, I mean, cowboys predominantly weren't white. I mean, none of this was accurate. But so by the time you get to like Unforgiven isn't a Western according to that strict definition. But clearly that genre then grows and adapts. And if you attempt to define the genre as like, you know, point one, clearly define morality. Well, all genres evolve. They're not a technical, precise term the way a medium is. And so all genres evolve. They subvert themselves. You know, I mean, your point about having overlapping genres is true of every single comedy, because comedy just means it's designed to be funny. You know, if it's a comedy that also, like, you know, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is a comedy that's also a drama. You know, it's about a messed up guy who doesn't have anywhere to go on Christmas. I mean, that is a serious drama. You know, and so, I mean, you can have, you know, I mean, that's a dramedy, and, you know, and then there are spectrums even beyond genre where spectrums of sort of how much comedy is present, but also how much realism. And I think, you know, like you mentioned, 2001 is, in a sense, super hard sci-fi, but it's also, if my first reaction was, yeah, it's also very concerned for realism, but it's also fundamentally a mystical movie. It has a lot more in common with like some weird, you know, Jodorowsky movie than it does with most realistic dramas.
No, that's true, and I think that's the thing is, like, you know, and I love the fact that you know, we will say this about cinema, about what people would be scared of in 56 or 59 and what they would be intolerable to now. every genre evolves and becomes more nuanced as well. I mean, I was literally having a conversation recently about action movies about this, and sort of like the birth of the action movie in the 80s is very lumpy, and it's literally sort of like, it's Arnie or Stallone or a couple of others, sort of like, and they're all the same. Okay, single protagonist takes on large numbers for whatever purpose, and sort of like, action ensues. That's it. But then it grew and it defined and becomes more nuanced. And then you're like, okay, well, now we've got a martial artist, and now we've got this and that, and we're going to introduce the Asian elements with Jackie Chan, and I love the fact that these changes, and that's the truth, though, isn't it? Sort of, you can go back and watch these films. And I think sci-fi is one of the things I will talk about in the next episode. But one of the things I'm looking back at these 50s ones is these ideas and going, this is how sci-fi was represented. Or, the science fiction genre was mixed with other things during the 50s. These were the concerns. These were the things that were on people's minds, or this was the stuff that they wanted to talk about, or this was just how they saw the world, in America. And then you sort of look at it and go, well, that's very 50s. It's time bound, because then you say, you move into the 60s and there's very different concerns. I think obviously cultural changes and social norms start to shift, and then you're able to have films, and you end up with films like 2001, where you go, yeah, the end of this film is incredibly trippy, and it can be interpreted in a number of different ways. You couldn't really interpret some of these other films. I think Earth versus the Flying Saucers. Pretty much only one way to interpret it. It's good fun, and it has certain things in it, but it's very straightforward. And I think so I think the evolution becomes a bit more sophisticated and a bit more open to that sort of mixture of different things. I think as we come into some of these other films we're going to talk about, especially for this season, we've got all kinds of things. You see that evolution of going we can do all kinds of things. Twist this knob here and twist that knob there, and you get something completely different. Yeah.
Yeah, and Earth versus the Flying Saucers is sort of a classic science fiction in that, when you think of sci-fi from the 50s, it seems very pure sci-fi. And yet, in a sense, I mean, it's an action movie, right? I mean, it's focused on the spectacle. Talking about genre, genres have to evolve or they die, right? You can't just keep making, Vincent Price can be the white male brainiac scientist, and he can get away with this stuff. You cannot do that today. We ask different questions. And for everybody complaining about social consciousness in, Get Out as a example of sci-fi plus social consciousness. Well, we were always doing that. Genres always merge with other genres and attempt to find some way to renovate, to make new again that experience. In the same way, Unforgiven is a complete reinvention of the Western from the old stuff. And you just can't get away with some of the old stuff because we ask questions that we didn't before. We are more aware of representation. And that's not a bad thing. Genres just have to evolve. And so I think, we have to make our peace with that. And often those genre movies that are, I think what's fascinating isn't necessarily the movies that set a new benchmark and become influential for, like in horror, you get to a point where there's no forward energy, and then you get something like Scream, that is just we're going to take all those cliches and consciously know them and have fun. And then you get to sort of Saw and Hostel and sort of body horror. But and then you get sci-fi stuff that has body horror, obviously that's prefigured by The Fly to some degree and everything Cronenberg. Anyway, I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting is also the alternate routes that these genres could have evolved in. The stuff that was new and was going in a different direction, but just didn't take off the way those movies did.
I think that, if the thing that had made all the money had been the spectacle, had been the gimmicks.
Mm.
If that's the thing that had caught on, I think, like I say, cinema would be very different in the 60s if everyone was like, no, you've got to have. How would that have escalated? Right. Well, we started with buzzing seats.
Yeah.
You know, now part of the cinema's got to burn down, and you know, we're gonna pump lava in or something. I don't know, sort of. But yeah, because obviously you've got to keep building on those spectacles and those interaction things. So, I'd be interested to see how that would have escalated. Anyway, I think we sort of we've talked about a lot about things. It sort of, I think this sort of shows that the Tingler sort of taps into a moment in history, but the film itself is well, I like the film. It's fun, but I don't think it's particularly deep or doing anything. But what are your final thoughts then on the Tingler?
Well, I love the meta stuff. Obviously, the meta stuff is the stuff that stays with me, and also as a cultural remnant of this time of experimentation with theaters and going in a way that ultimately sort of became the amusement park theatrical experience. It is, as a final thought, I love how it's absurd, but I love how murderous the Tingler is. Like I love it's an alien. It's not alien, but it's a sort of being that inhabits all of us. You know, I mean, it's a kind of daft but cool idea. But I love that anytime it gets loose, it's just like knows the human neck and it's like, I'm gonna get my pincers around the human neck. Like it craves murder. And I kind of love that about this. Like it's kind of demonic in a way.
I love the fact they say it feeds on fear, but at no point do they explain how they know that or how it does it. It just through osmosis. It you know, not that fear generates a chemical in the body and it absorbs that. No, it just feeds on fear. I do enjoy this film, and you know, I'm a Vincent Price fan, so I love all the schlocky sort of stuff that you know, and some of the more dramatic stuff. But this film sort of hits the sweet spot for me in that it's sort of this partnered with House on Haunted Hill, the 1959 William Castle film. It's just that moment in history, that moment in time when they were trying to do something for cinema, knowing that you know that actually this maybe they've got to compete with TV, they've got to compete with these other things, and doing this stuff is really cool. And so I do enjoy the sort of the silliness of this film, and the fact that, like I say, this film was actually made in 12 days.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I believe it was written in 3 and made in 12. So, you know, it shows the cinemas were banging this stuff out, and William Castle was more about the spectacle. And it's one of those times of, you know, we talk about auteur cinema, you know, and later on that appears on screen. And I find that sort of William Castle's probably got more in common with P.T. Barnum or one of those, like you say, circus performers, where it's less about the quality of the film. Like he's not going to have a distinctive shot, you know, he's not going to use a certain type of panning or anything like that. It's more that his films are a theme park attraction, and that sort of really appeals to me. So I think it's really fun, and I'm glad we got to talk about some of the bits and pieces. But that's our 50s block, really. We've done, and I've really enjoyed it. And I'm not going to spoil anything. I've got some thoughts, but save that for the next episode. And we will be coming back to talk about all the films that we've talked about and recap them. And before we move on to our main sort of the rest of the season.
And we'll give the ratings for the 50s film.
Yes.
And hopefully get into some interesting arguments. Yeah,
this one might actually go. But yes, I think we will. I think it'll be you know, and you know, so we're going to be going back, and I think, you know, any chance quickly to touch back on Quatermass and other things as well. So I'm really looking forward to sort of just rounding this out. But don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, this is just the start. This is just the beginning of this season. We've done our 50s block. We did a special decade devoted to the decade, and we are going to be moving up on out, and we've got all kinds of stuff coming up. You mentioned, Julie, you got Eyes Without a Face. We've got Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Buckaroo Banzai, Vanilla Sky, The Man Who Fell to Earth. So many different things. We've got such a variety. We've got a Stallone film coming up. We've got Gattaca. I haven't watched Gattaca in years. I'm so excited to talk about that film because I was all about that film for a period in the 90s. So very excited to go back and talk about that. So ladies and gentlemen, lots and lots to look forward to. killer plants, DNA manipulation, and aliens. So all of it fantastic sci-fi stuff. So, Julian, thank you as always. A fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it.
I love it as always. And we're at Pod Time Space.
Oh yeah, Christ, yes. Come find us at Pod Time Space. Tell us what you think. Before we get to the next episode, what have you thought about our 50s block? Have you enjoyed it? What should we do another decade dedication? We've covered quite a few others, but let us know what you think. Come find us at Pod Time Space. But other than that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and we shall see you on the next episode.
I'm returning my vibrator.
There's something very important I forgot to tell you.
What?
Don't cross the streams.